Hey friends, I'm Ash Leatherwood, your friendly neighborhood apologist, and today we have a very special guest with us as we talk through suffering, suicide, and faith in its relationship to apologetics. So with me today is Jennifer Defrates, who is a former high school teacher turned homeschool mom turned apologist. She started as a Christian mommy blogger at Heaven Not Harvard before finding apologetics. She's currently volunteering with Mama Bear Apologetics and doing some pro-life research and work. She also writes at themomapologist.com. So thanks for joining us, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So first, just to kind of set the tone of the conversation, starting off just very broad, how did you find apologetics? How did you get into apologetics? We kind of heard a little bit about your story of how you got into it, but maybe you can unpack that a little bit.
So I knew that there was something called apologetics because Christian summer camp when I was a kid had talked about it, but I wasn't really familiar with what it was. I grew up believing that Christianity was true and I had no reason to doubt it. So it was like information you kind of file back in the back of your head, like, it's nice to know that somebody has proven that this is true, but it wasn't like front of my mind, right? Until I got really serious about my faith. I was kind of a cultural Christian and I went to church, believed in God. I thought that was kind of the deal. Like that was Christianity. And then God was like, that's like the start. Like you've got to reframe what you think is Christianity. And I was like, okay. And I started really reading my Bible, like on fire. I read it 3 times in 18 months. And when you do that, it really changes who you are. Like it starts coming out of your mouth. Bible verses are just kind of how you live. It's like, oh, why did you do that? Well, Matthew 6 says, and the more that happened, the more I changed, the more my husband kind of went the other direction. And he found the YouTube atheists, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Many of your audience probably knows a lot of them. But he started throwing like things at me that I had never heard before. Like there are more mistakes in the New Testament than there are words. I was like, what? And I Google it, and of course that's accurate, kind of, right? And then I found, what did he say? He said, we don't have the original New Testament. How do you even know that what you believe is true when we don't have the originals? We don't even have the copies of the originals. We don't even have the copies of the copies of the copies. And my whole world started to crumble. I thought, is everything I've believed my whole life a lie? Have I based my values, my decisions, my parenting, everything on something fake? And luckily, I think God intervened in my Google search, and I ended up finding Cold Case Christianity and J. Warner Wallace. And of course, then through his podcast and books, I was introduced to the world of apologetics, which really changed everything because I found out not only are there good answers for all the objections that my husband had, but there were answers for some of the questions that I had never really let myself delve into. And it became part of strengthening my faith to know that there were really answers out there. Yeah. But I thought that apologetics was going to be the way that I helped my husband like get over his objections, and that's not really what happened. Unfortunately, he suffered from PTSD from his military service, and he lost that battle and committed suicide a couple years ago. And when that happened, apologetics is what saved my faith, because in that moment when you've lost the person that you love most in the world, other than my child, the trauma and the tragedy specifically, at the shock, the horror, I had nowhere to run except to God, because I knew in my heart that God was real. The Bible was true. Like I literally lay in bed that night crying and still walking myself through the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. and saying, okay, God, I don't understand how this was the answer to prayer that I'd prayed for years. I know you're still real and I know you're still there. Help me trust you when I don't feel like I can trust you. Kind of like the help my unbelief verse, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And I just prayed that over and over again. And apologetics really helped me save my faith. And then my daughter's, as she's dealt with the grief of losing her dad. She'd be like, I'm not sure I believe in God anymore. I was like, as soon as you can tell me where the universe came from. She's like, okay, God's real. I'm just mad at him. Like, okay, we can start there.
Yeah, no, I definitely relate to that. Like, I think a special thing about apologetics is it's not just an intellectual game, but it's solid ground that you can hold on to when everything else feels shaken and snatched away. Definitely, that's part of my story. I came to apologetics as someone who had just gone through grief, losing my mother to cancer. And apologetics is really what kept me in the church when everything around me was telling me to leave. There's no point in staying. So apologetics really gave me that firm ground that, like, if this is true and I can believe that it's true, there's reason to think so, then this is something worth staking my life on. So I think that's the special thing about apologetics. You kind of said it there that you were studying it and it turned out it wasn't primarily for your husband, it was for you and how it impacted your life. And I feel like that's the special thing about apologetics. Like, we can study it to have conversations with other people, and that's all fine and good, and that's great. But that so oftentimes that apologetics first and foremost helps us in our own faith in navigating all the things that we can't expect in life, knowing that, okay, God, you are God, and I'm not. I can believe in you. Sort of like Job comes to at the end of the book, that you just have to trust God even when you can't trust God. But it's not as if it's like a blind faith. It's trusting him because of what he's already revealed. Like, that's what I love about you saying, like, you were going through the cosmological argument, you're going through the teleological argument. It's like God has revealed himself and he's loved us enough that we can just hold on to him and trust him and know that he's there. Even if we don't understand why stuff happened or what's happening next, we can know he's there and he's good. So I relate to that a lot. So I'm curious, and this is gonna be kind of a two-part question. So as you're hearing these objections brought up by your husband, were there any arguments that maybe you'd never thought about before that were particularly hard for you to think through and answer right at first? And then after that, we'll dive into the question. What were the arguments and what did it look like to turn to apologetics going through grief? So we'll kind of unpack both of those.
So honestly, I had never heard any of the objections before. They were all kind of like, oh, I mean, I had heard, obviously, I don't believe God exists. But the more focused on the New Testament arguments, those were really hard for me because I didn't understand that I didn't know we didn't have the originals. To understand that we have copies of the copies of the copies of the copies is like, that's kind of earth shaking. And to understand how that works, how we know with like a 99.3% accuracy that we have the same we had in, the apostles had, that even atheists will tell us this. Like, even Bart Ehrman believes that we have the original New Testament to over a 99% certainty. So that was something that was really powerful, to know that what we're reading has less than a 1% variation, and none of the differences affect any massive doctrine. There might be tiny little things, but most of it's covered somewhere else. So a lot of it is exactly what the disciples wrote, exactly what they believed and lived by, and we can be assured that that is true. And I think that was one of the most important things that I learned through dealing with some of his objections. Other than knowing that there's almost an answer for every single objection you can imagine. Someone has covered it. There is almost no question you can think of that there isn't an answer for somewhere. Now, you may not agree with the answer, but there's a Christian apologist somewhere has attempted to deal with almost every single objection.
Yeah. So you think that relates to looking in the right place? Like, I have friends that when they start struggling with doubt, they go straight to all the atheist YouTubers, like the people who might have had the same doubt and kind of went down another path. rather than giving like a chance to the Christian apologist to cover the same questions? So do you think it kind of relates to looking in the right places for answers to questions, not just for other people who share the same doubts and went just this one way with it?
I think it's really important that we look at both sides.
Yeah.
We can't just look at one, the side that we already agree with. You know, that's an echo chamber. That's what we see in our country today, is people only listen to the point of view that they already agree with. And because of that, you never learn anything new.
Yeah.
You never grow as a person. You know, even if you're 100% sure of your position and it's being the right answer, it doesn't hurt you to listen to another side. If you are sure you have truth on your side, then you should be able to listen to both sides of the argument. I found that that's really important, especially dealing with the pro-life issue, is I know truth is on my side. But if I don't listen to the other side's concerns or questions, I'm not going to know how to answer them. I'm not going to be able to think through the reasons I hold my position. And I think a lot of times people say, well, I don't want to believe in God, therefore I'm only going to look at, you know, this person's opinion, instead of doing the real research of getting to the bottom of something. Like, one of the issues I'm currently researching for my apologetics class is whether or not Christmas is pagan. Because it's all over the internet. Everyone's always, well, Christmas took Christmas trees from this culture, and we actually put the date of Christmas on that day because of this culture. And it's like, we've got to learn how to do better research, people. If you go all the way down to the very first time we see these things, Christmas was set on December 25th before 222 AD. That is the earliest date for any holiday on December 25th. There's no contest. But I had to be willing to dive in and say, what are people saying? Where is the contradiction there? And find the actual original document that shows this. It's actually a statue of Hippolytus of Rome, and it dates to 222 AD, and it has quotations from his treatise on it. So we know that that was written before, because nobody makes a statue of some random person. So he was already important, and the treatise was already important if they quoted it and put it on a statue. You know,
I think that's just a really helpful point. Just be willing to commit to the research. Like, don't just listen to one perspective, but like dive into what is available, which includes going to both sides, you know, all three sides, however sides of it there are. Like, be willing to commit to the question if you're really that interested, and to actually find out what there is to know about it. So I think that's really helpful when navigating apologetics and doubts and questions that come up.
I think the other thing is really that you don't have to have every answer. At some point, you have to have enough answers to decide which side of the table you're going to fall on. And I think there's enough evidence for Christianity to say, okay, I'm going to be a Christian, even though I don't have every answer that I could possibly want. You know, at some point, we're going to get some of those answers in heaven, but we're not going to get every answer. Like, what's up with dinosaurs? No, you know, I have my opinions, but there's things that you hold loosely and say, I think I have some understanding of this. And it's okay to say, you know what, I'm not sure I have an answer on this issue, but I still know God created everything. The universe was still designed. Jesus still walked out of that grave. We have no explanation for the actions of the disciples following, you know, his resurrection. We can't explain origin of life. And the moral, but why do we have a sense that things are right or wrong, evil or good, if God doesn't exist? So those are my 5 kind of go-tos when I'm having doubt, is those things are still true, even if I can't explain why God created triceratopses.
Yeah, no, I love that. And then you just like, I imagine like your explanation of that is like looking at the smaller doubts and questions within the context of these larger things that you already have found answers for. That, I guess, not isolating each individual doubt and question, making it the whole deal, but rather having the backdrop of the other answers that we do have, so that even if I can't figure out this one little thing, it's okay, I have the other things already worked out. And so I can hold to that, even when I will never get the answer for this one thing. So I think that's really helpful. And even just connecting that with your story. So I'm curious, what did that look like navigating through grief and finding out like when is enough enough? And what did it look like having just emotions attached to these questions that I feel like before grief can feel very abstract and maybe loosely connected to life? I think going through grief, sometimes questions about God and life and sin, I feel like come so much closer. So I'm curious, what did that look like in your story, navigating through grief and asking these questions and looking into apologetics?
I think I just spent a lot of time holding on to those 5 things because at that point I was pretty well versed in apologetics. But being able to hold those 5 things while I also held a broken heart and say, I don't have to have an answer today. I don't have to be happy with the answer that God has given me to my prayer today. To know that God works all things to my good. I've seen that in my own life, but we see it throughout Scripture. You know, the story of Joseph and how his being sold into slavery and then thrown into jail ends up causing him to be able to be in a position to save all of Israel. Like that story was one that really helped me navigate the painful time in my life. Like it was 20 years between the time he had his vision, like his dreams, to the time that he actually saved Israel, because he knew how to, knew to save the grain and things and be able to provide for his family, and they moved there. 20 years. Like that reminds me that we sometimes have this very narrow focus of our lifetime. We want answers right now, today. And remembering that God's economy is eternal helped me say, okay, not everybody gets an origin story and is the hero. Some of us just have a little lifetime here where we do the best we can to glorify God, and we don't get the answers we want to prayer. You know, the Babylon exile, everybody loves to quote Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, right? He's talking to Israel, not to us. Now, does he have plans for us? Yes, we read in Ephesians, we know he has plans for us. But those specific promises came after 70 years of exile, being treated as slaves, being hauled off. It says, some of you are going to die here. Get married, have kids, build homes. Some of you will never see this promise fulfilled. Like that's verse 10. Like that helped me remember, just because I don't see an answer that makes me feel like this had meaning doesn't mean there isn't one. So some of what helped me navigate it wasn't really apologetics as much as it was a solid understanding of my Bible. So the apologetics tells me my Bible is true, and the Bible tells me that I can have faith and trust in who God is. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, that does. That's perfect. So I'm curious, in the years since you've gotten more into apologetics and asked bigger questions like regarding suicide especially, what has been your thought process on suicide and a Christian view on that? What's that look like when you have someone close to you that's struggling with that or asking questions about that, or maybe someone who's even experienced the loss of a family member? What would you say to that person?
So there's a couple different answers depending on who somebody is. A lot of people think suicide's the unforgivable sin still, and that if you committed suicide, you're automatically going to hell. I think that is really not biblical. And I think it's important that we unpack that for people, because if somebody thinks that that's true, that's devastating, and the way to think about salvation is that Jesus paid for our sins. The moment we follow him, he covers all of our sins. He covers all the sins that I'm going to commit when I'm 90 years old. Like, it's covered, it's done. So committing suicide may be a sin, but it's not unforgivable. And there are solid Christian people who struggle with mental illness. And if our brain is broken, like, how do you know that you're taking in information correctly and understanding the world correctly? You don't. And we make decisions sometimes based on faulty information. It's like my glasses. My vision's not terrible, but if I take off my glasses, I'm going to see the world a little bit differently. These give me a little clarity, right? If your brain isn't working properly, you have no way to know that. You have to trust somebody else that tells you, hey, you're not thinking that through correctly, or I'm not sure that that's an accurate representation of what's going on in your life. So people who have mental illness or struggle with depression and things, I think there's an aspect of mercy that God understands that our physical bodies limit how we function and what we can think. So it might be a sin, but that's not how God decides our salvation. Our salvation is based on who Christ is and if we belong to Christ. And that's a decision that isn't split second. It could be. The thief on the cross said, hey, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said, you'll be with me tonight. So suicide can absolutely be forgiven. There are people that have committed suicide, I guarantee you, that are in heaven right now. Does that mean we should commit suicide? So the next part is then, if someone is struggling with suicidal ideation and struggling with, why do I even exist? This goes back to understanding our purpose. If you have breath in your lungs today, then there's a reason you live. There's a reason you're here. Find it. Like, what can you do to take care of somebody else? Because I have found personally that that's the thing that gets me out of bed. If I sat around thinking about the things I don't have anymore, my husband being gone, there's so many parts of losing a spouse, that's just, it's kind of like losing a limb. And it could be overwhelming. But when I think about, okay, Jennifer, God woke you up this morning. What are you doing? That gets me up out of bed, because then I can think about, there's at least one person that doesn't know Jesus that I might be able to share that with. And it might be so random as like when I got my hair cut a few weeks ago, I had a t-shirt on that led the stylist to ask me a question. So I started talking apologetics, and the girl sweeping up hair 2 chairs over went, hey, wait, what did you just say? She said, that sounds like it's going to answer all the questions my boyfriend and I have been talking about. Wow. Just totally random, but it wasn't, because those are the things that God orchestrates. And when we're struggling with what our meaning is, what our purpose is, when we trust that God has a meaning and purpose for our lives, all we have to do is seek to glorify him in what we're doing on a daily basis. That's when we kind of can set aside some of the depression stuff, and not every kind of depression can be dealt with that way. We also need to consider therapy and medication and getting legitimate help from a trusted professional. God gave us the ability to use logic and reason and science. Those things are tools that he has given us to use. They should be definitely part of the equation in dealing with depression and mental illness and suicidal ideation. But for me, because if you're around someone who's committed suicide, if you're kind of in that sphere, it increases the likelihood of you committing suicide by like 3 times or something. You're like 66% more likely to commit suicide if someone close to you has committed suicide. So it's one of those things that just is part of the struggle of dealing with the grief and the loss and the hopelessness. And to be able to take that and say, I still have a meaning and purpose. If one person comes to Christ because of me, or if I help one person think through their faith so that they stay solid, am I willing to suffer the next 50 years of my life on earth and wait for heaven so that I could help one person? Yeah, I am.
Yeah. And that sounds a lot like what the Apostle Paul said, like that he would much rather go and be with the Lord, but that it's more necessary for him to stay for the sake of the church. So that's really cool. And I'm just imagining like a cycle in my head, like apologetics matters because it helps us realize that Christianity is true. And it's not just like an argument that we just argue with people, but because Christianity is true, that means there's hope for our lives, even when it's hard. So apologetics is inherently personal and practical in life, in that it helps us wake up every morning and have that hope. Even when we wake up and it hurts, even when we wake up we don't want to get out of bed that day, it does bring hope because it confirms the truth of Christianity and that Jesus still has a point for waking us up that morning, which is huge. Like you said, even just seeing the interactions you've had, it's just cool seeing that like apologetics helps us personally, but then it also happens in the conversations we have, you know, even at the hairdresser, at the restaurant, or park bench, wherever you are. So I love just the connection between apologetics and hope, and how we've seen that in this discussion. But kind of talking more about specific arguments, I'm curious if you have any favorite arguments that have been particularly interesting to you or helpful to you throughout your time in apologetics.
Well, I think the origin of life has probably been one of the ones that I really have leaned into, because there's a lot of questions about evolution and prehistoric things that we don't understand completely. And when I look at what we do know about origin of life, there is no way we went from non-life to life.
Mm.
Nobody can explain this. James Tour, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he literally just had a conversation with a bunch of scholars at Harvard, and I think it was Harvard. It was Ian Cronin was the pro-evolution side, and they can't explain what mechanism allows for non-living things to have natural selection. Like, how did we get to a point where chlorine became chlorine? Like, it's one thing to say an animal with a certain trait survives better, therefore it passes on its genetic material. But how did you get like all of the proteins that were necessary, all the chemicals that were necessary, and then all the proteins have to fold themselves correctly? There's no way to get there. I think there's a metaphor or a story that helps me think about it. In order to get one properly sequenced protein, it's the equivalent of blindfolding somebody and dropping them in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and they have to pick a marked grain of sand 3 times in a row blindfolded.
Mm.
I don't think that's possible. I don't think you could do it 3 times in a row with a bowl of sand, much less the Sahara Desert worth. And that's to get one protein, and we need 150 to 200 of them for the most simple form of life.
That's crazy.
So there are times when you still have those doubts. You wake up and go, is this all like stuff that I'm tricking myself into believing? You know, using philosophy and wordplay to convince myself this is true. And when you get to something like that and you go, no, there has to be a God, because we can't explain this. And not like we can't explain it like we couldn't explain thunderstorms in ancient Greece. But we can't explain it. And the more we understand about it, the less we can explain it. You know, when we look at the cell and how a cell works, we used to kind of think it was a cell wall, a nucleus, and a bunch of goo. Now we understand the stuff that's going on inside that cell is so complicated, we don't even have a clue how that works.
Yeah.
Have you seen the movie Big Hero 6?
Mm-hmm.
They use the little black things and they build stuff with their mind.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's part of how the cell actually works. Like, it builds pathways and it builds things to move stuff around the cell and then tears it back and rebuilds it. It's like, oh my goodness. So I'm not a microbiologist, but just listening to someone explain that, I'm like, oh, we have no idea how that works. There's no way that this was an accident. The chemicals required for life, for them to all pop into existence by themselves on their own at the right exact time in the same puddle at the right purity levels in the right order, and then have electricity go through them. I mean, we can take all of the components of a cell and put it in a test tube and we still can't make it live.
Mm.
But we think somehow this happened on accident. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. It's not that we're arguing from what we don't know, but we're arguing from what we do know. Like the more we do research, like you said, like the more we unpack the cell or life, like we see it's more complex than what we previously thought. That's what I love about the book by Michael Behe, Darwin's Black Box. That before it's just like a black box that we just kind of didn't know much about, simple inside, but Behe argues that now that we've opened the black box, we see how much more complex it is inside than we previously thought. And so that's what it's been with the cell and everything else, that the more we unpack it, the more we research it, science actually allows us to see it's far more complicated and precise than we previously thought, to indicate that maybe there's intelligence behind it. So I also find the origin and complexity of life super fascinating. I've always loved science ever since I was a little kid. I used to open science books and do the experiments for fun. I was a nerd. But I think it's super interesting, even just every year, the more that we learn about new organisms being discovered or the complexities of processes within life being discovered, it's super fascinating. So I think that's super fun argument to dive into. But are there any books on both the origin of life that you found particularly helpful, and then in apologetics as well? Any particular books that you found impactful for you personally?
I think I'm frozen again. I would say that Michael Behe, Darwin's Doubt, Stephen C. Meyer, The God Hypothesis, Michael Gillen, I'm not sure how you say his last name, it might be Guillen. He wrote Believing is Seeing, and I thought that really interesting take on creation and the cosmological teleological argument. I've read so many books, it's hard to pick one or two that are a favorite. If someone read any apologetics books, I would start with anything by J. Warner Wallace, or I Don't Have Enough Faith in an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norm Geisler. Those are going to be really good, like get your feet wet kind of thing. Natasha Crane's books are great because even though they're written as if you're having a conversation with your children, each chapter is like 1 page or 2 pages. So you get a question, you get a quick couple of answers, maybe 3 pages, it's short. And you get direction of places you can go look up more information if you want. Mama Bear Apologetics, of course. There's 2 books so far, and a 3rd one is coming out in spring. That one's going to be more focused on prayer and kind of for believers. But the 2 Mama Bear Apologetics books are really Apologetics 101 as well, and ways that we can be passing that on to the people around us. I mean, especially if you're a parent, although most of your audience probably isn't yet, but you will be someday. You'd be amazed at what age your kids are asking tough questions. I think my daughter was like 7, and I'm trying to put her to bed, and she's like, "Mom, can you explain the Trinity?" I just don't want to go to sleep. So
yeah, that's funny. Yeah, no, that's good. So kind of bringing our conversation full circle, how would you kind of summarize the points that we've gone over on both grief and suffering and suicide, as well as the relationship between apologetics and hope? What would be your concluding thoughts to our viewers?
Learning that Christianity is true, understanding that apologetics can teach us that this is fundamentally true, gives us a worldview that is eternal. And I think that's really important because when we believe this life is all we get, I mean, America's not in great shape, but we're still doing pretty well compared to a lot of the world. So we have to think about this globally, not just for what we're personally experiencing. But if we think about this life on this planet with all its suffering and brokenness, this is all we get, that's super depressing. When we can look at apologetics and go, okay, we know we have a soul. We know we're going to live eternally. There's far too much evidence that a soul exists. And there's obviously debate over whether or not apologists should use near-death experiences as an apologetic, but I think the fact that they exist, verifiable near-death experiences, where something happens that someone reports back after they come back from being dead, we know that there's more to us than this flesh.
Mm.
You know, there's a spirit part of us that's going to exist when this stops. That needs to give us hope. There is something after this life. When we understand that, then we have to decide, okay, what does it look like? And that's what apologetics helps us do. If God is real, then how do we trust the Bible? If we trust the Bible, then we can figure out what eternity looks like and how to get there. So that's how it all kind of connects to me, is apologetics teaches us that there is a God. He knew your name before he spoke, let there be light. He created things for you to do in this life that only you can do. You know, we all look in the mirror sometimes and go, why am I not taller? Why am I not better looking? Why am I not skinnier? Why am I not smarter? God literally took the pieces and put you together because you have a specific purpose on this planet that only you can fulfill.
Mm.
When you understand that, it changes everything.
Mm.
Because then you walk through your day looking for ways to impact the world around you, the people that like you as a friend. God created you to fit in that place. So apologetics isn't just arguing people, and I think that's the place where I've kind of reached after a couple of years, is I don't want to argue with people. I want to have conversations, and I want to show people how to think things through logically. You know, it's real easy to shout your opinion at somebody. It's really hard to say, hey, can I walk this through with you? And I recently had one of those conversations where I walked through a tough issue with a fellow believer, but she was like, I have studied this and studied this and studied this. I'm not going to change my mind.
Mm.
And I said, well, would you be willing to at least look at what I found in my research and just talk with me? And it was a miracle. We had a civil and productive conversation on Facebook. So there must be a God, right? But seriously, though, we got to the end of our conversation where she said, well, this is what I think. And I was like, okay, let me push back a little. What about this? Have you ever looked at it this way? And she was able at the end to go, I can't believe this, but you have totally changed my mind. So that was really, to me, it was like, oh, that's what I think we need to be doing. It's not just studying the arguments, but learning how to share them with people in a way that they can hear us, and teach other people to share them so that they can have conversations. I just read an article yesterday that said our current generation has lost the ability to think because they're surrounded by an echo chamber. I mean, when you go to a college class, the chances of you hearing a conservative or Christian viewpoint is almost zero. And you know, if you say something that's conservative or Christian sounding, you're going to get, you're a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're racist, you're a Christian nationalist. Like, you're not going to have someone who says, oh, I never thought about the issue that way. Because you have to be the first person to shout that viewpoint down to be an ally. That no one's allowed to bring up, hey, is this really the best thing? Like all the transgender stuff. If somebody even says, I think this is still a mental illness, and that we do better treating the mental aspect before trying to change the body, even from a secular viewpoint, they're completely shut down. They've lost jobs. We don't know how to talk to each other and say, can I introduce some new information to the way you're thinking about this? And if we want apologetics to succeed, we've got to start teaching people how to think and reason and have tough conversations before we can even get to the arguments. because they're just going to throw a slogan back at us. Well, it's my body, my choice. If they're going to shout like slogans at you, you can't even get through the slogan. Just wait, there's another body there. So we've got to bring down the defenses and say, man, I hear you. How can we talk about this in a way that you can hear what I really think and I can hear what you really think? And if neither one of us change our opinions at the end of the day, that's okay. Because when that happens, people then, oh, and they're open maybe to listening to something that they don't agree with. When they feel respected, they feel heard, and you've taken down the threat level. Hey, you don't change your mind, that's okay. I'm still going to be your friend. But I just share a little bit of what I think. I think that makes people more open to hearing your point of view, especially if you hear them out first. Hey, explain to me what you're thinking on this issue. And then you've got a way, first of all, that helps you understand where they're coming from. But it also helps you understand where their thinking maybe isn't quite logical and be able to push back on some of those things. You know, Greg Koukl does a really good job of showing you how to use those kind of tactics. Tactics is another great book. Or Street Smarts, his new book. I don't know if you've read that one yet, but he walks you through how to have these conversations with people in like literally tangible, like you say this, they'll say this, you say this. And that's really helpful because a lot of times we're afraid to even have the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think that's huge. Like, just there's so many gold nuggets to what you just said. Like, I love how you talk about how these are hard conversations, but like they're worth having because there's meaning and hope and joy and life attached to these conversations. But so much more than just like apologetics, like it is inherently conversational and it should be, like you're saying. I think it can be so easy to get in the mindset of like, okay, I know this stuff and I want to use it, so I need to go and argue with someone. But like, it really doesn't happen like that. And that's not going to make for the fruitful conversation so much as just the conversation you're going to have with someone that you don't even need to be super direct in trying to bring these things up in conversation, but really just know what you believe, know why you believe it, be happy to talk about it when stuff like that comes into the conversation, because it will. And when it does, we need to do so with gentleness and respect, and with joy and with the insight, ask intentional questions. So I love so much of what you just said. And yeah, definitely go read books by Greg Koukl, for all you guys watching. But yeah, that's why I like the word apologetics because I know where it comes from. But I personally, when talking to someone trying to make the sales pitch for apologetics, I like to call it worldview engagement, because it is. It's just knowing how to interact with your neighbors and ask good questions and really try to understand them, know where they're coming from, and then ask good questions that gets them thinking. So I think that's huge. Yeah, I think this has been a really helpful conversation. So I hope you viewers got to pull out lots of just helpful points from this, lots of good books. So really just the reason that apologetics should be important to each one of us and how we can interact with our neighbors with the things that we learn. So if you want to learn more about worldview engagement, I've been releasing a lot of videos on interacting with different worldviews, Islam, Hinduism. You can go and check those out. But if they want to see more of your content and things you're working on, Jennifer, where can they find more about you?
So I've been writing for Mama Bear Apologetics. So some of their recent articles are things that I've been working on. One of the pro-life projects I'm working on right now is something that will come out next year. So it's going to be a while before they're going to see the fruits of that labor, but just keep an eye out. And I will be working on some things for Mama Bear in January for pro-life, the Sanctity of Life Sunday and the pro-life march. We're going to have a podcast and a blog. You can also go to my website, The Mom Apologist, and you can find me on Facebook or Instagram. I'm on Twitter, but I don't spend a lot of time on X because it's just, it tends to be a kind of a negative environment. And one of the things I've learned when you go through tragedy is that there's only so much suffering you can hold on to. And sometimes it's wise to step back from some of the social media, but you can find me there. But it's the Mama, M-A-M-A, Apologist. So it's all one word, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And then at Heaven Not Harvard, if you're interested in parenting, marriage, just Christian living. Because I think they kind of go together. And a lot of people separate them. Like apologetics is this separate thing, but my apologetics has become why I'm a good mom. Because I've learned that the fruit of the Spirit is peace, because I trust that God is real. Is patience, because I know how God has been patient with me. Is gentleness, because I've seen God's gentleness in dealing with my grief. Like these things go together when you really experience who God is fully, they kind of connect. So I think we shouldn't always separate them into two separate camps, like Christian living and apologetics are two different things. I think we froze again. So we shouldn't separate those into two different camps necessarily. I think it's important that we treat them as two parts of a whole. We have Christian living, we have apologetics, and they go together. They're not separate.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I feel like that kind of wraps up our conversation perfectly, that apologetics isn't separate from your life and what you're going through and what you're thinking through, that they go together. So, so yeah, guys, don't be afraid to ask these questions and commit to the research. And also just be able to think through what you're learning and know when enough is enough and how to move on to next things. So, guys, this is Jennifer Defrates. Be sure to check out all the resources that she's mentioned. If you guys found this conversation just helpful and fruitful and helps you just through what you're thinking through, hope you guys have a great Christmas break, as many of you are just getting off about now. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.